Good morning, good evening, good day, greetings and salutations, and throw in a welcome as well to the Safe Room featuring Security SideQuest. My name is Tristan Watty, and I am joined today by the marvelous, the mysterious, the marvel, bless, Russ. How's it going? I got to make it rhyme every time, so that's where I go with that. How are you today, Russ?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
I'm doing great, even though it's a little hot outside. Hopefully keep it chill with today's stream, or maybe not. We'll figure it out. Spoilers. But for those who are joining in for the first time, again, I am Tristan Watty. I am a senior security consultant within AWS, within the professional services division, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in a secure manner, fashion, and way. And Russ, where are you?
I'm coming from the customer incident response team. We help our customers mitigate and remediate incidents in their accounts.
Yes. And it's a great place to be because you see a lot of fun stuff. And speaking of fun stuff, hi, Mel, Ari, nice to join in. And Pete, thank you. Yes, it is very hot outside. If you're on the East Coast, you kind of feel it, right? It's funny because I'm just like, I should drink water. One of those little things that you kind of, take for granted until you go outside, you're like sweating.
Yeah.
But I digress. So we said where we're coming in from. Audience, chat, feel free to say, hey, where are you coming in from? Where are you dialing in? Where are you listening? Where are you viewing from? We always like to know, right? Because it's fun to see where everybody's tuning in. As well as today's fun, let's say, starter question. And I pose this to you, Russ. What's your favorite social video game?
So that's a tough one. I think there's, because we're nerds, and so we tend to nitpick. So I'm going to try to not do that and just say, for me, my favorite social video game was specifically during the pandemic when everyone was getting into Animal Crossing.
Nice.
That was the best for me. I had the most fun playing with like random people that I would have never played games with before. So I'm gonna go with
That's a good one because you go. It's a nice chill. See, this is a theme going on, right? We're trying to keep chill by saying it over and over. But yeah, Animal Crossing is a good one. For a second, I thought you were going to troll and say Solitaire, but I was like, he's this close to saying it. For me, the social video game really takes me back to Street Fighter. And for a myriad of reasons, because online and in the arcades. Because that's how you said hi in the 90s, right? Dating myself a little bit. You went to the arcade, threw in a quarter, and you're just like, all right, we're going to play and never see each other again, right? So even though it was the same pizzeria that we used to go to, but I digress. But I also say hello, Pete, from Southwest and from LA. Thanks for joining in. Some good places.
Some warm places.
Yeah, right? But today's topic, where are we going today, Russ?
Today we're going to be talking about threat hunting. Today our episode is among logs inside the mind of a threat hunter. And then this is a little bit more in depth than our intro threat hunting episode, but you don't have to have seen that or any of our previous episodes to still follow along. We just want to go into a little bit more of like a practical what to do for threat hunting and what to look at and all those spoilers. Yeah,
and I think that's a good place to start. Is like, hey, you could jump right into this because we're going into the mindset of a threat hunter, right? What goes behind the scenes, and like, all right, this is my automatic reflex. And if you get the titles kind of play on words with among logs, there's another game of the among variety, I would say, that goes along with it. So if you get that, 10 points to you. And I think where we start within today's show is just kind of going into exactly that. How do threat hunters think when they're looking through security logs? Because there's so many log sources that you can look through, hopefully, right? That's one of the things we talked through, just have a couple of different log sources. Always like to point that out. Then also, why the logs matter when you're threat hunting, right? Because it's exploration into the different key log sources. That's kind of the key, for lack of better words, those correlation techniques, things of that nature. And then how do a threat hunter, or how do threat hunters kind of piece together all these different logs to find an attack? And then what are the common tools? What are you going to use? And this, they have a run book. I think Russ is a big fan of that type of stuff. I think Russ, he's a fan of a lot of different types of books of the run variety. Sometimes there's some plans in there, but we'll get to that bit later. Right? So I think one of the things that we start off with is answering the question to ourselves is, what is the go-to tool for catching imposters within your AWS environment? What is your tool, Russ?
Yeah, so I'm going to go with, technically two tools. If we're talking about our most vital, then I'm going with CloudTrail Event History. And then whatever tool you want to use to be able to query that. So I use Athena just because it's easy and, just have some SQL queries. But you could use any other, like a third-party, log aggregator, whatever it is you're using. But inside an AWS environment, I'm looking at CloudTrail Event History and then using Athena to be able to query and parse those logs.
Yeah, and we also have a question. Can you give an example of how CloudTrail helped you to address some questions? I guess.
Okay.
What's that to you, Russ?
Yeah, a little bit of spoilers, but for example, CloudTrail Event History shows all API calls at the management level. And so, for example, for me, that helps when I'm doing things like looking to see who has created new users or access keys or, signs of persistence and stuff like that. So, so an attack on a website that is running on EC2 is a little bit of a difference. So you're actually going to have like your actual web app logs for that, and your network access logs. So that would be a little bit less applicable to inside the AWS environment, but still important to be able to do threat hunting or incident response or whatever, to have that visibility. So if you're having issues within your web app, you have to go through not just your Amazon or AWS event history logs, but you also have to go through your VPC flow logs, your web app logs. I mean, it could be anywhere within that whole process in your infrastructure that could be the issue. So basically having visibility is the first step. You have to have those logs. Let's just kind of jump right into it, because we're already talking about logs. So when we discuss logs, I think of immediately the CloudTrail event history, VPC flow logs, and then also having IAM activity logs. So that's going to be the big three. Within CloudTrail event history, that's going to be a record of all of the API activity within the AWS account. So that's going to be huge for any unauthorized API calls that are made, changes to management level infrastructure or settings or config, unusual activity, whether that's in administrator accounts or the root user, stuff like that, using things like cross-region activities. Sometimes that could be difficult to notice because you're mostly working in US East 1 and there's some stuff in AP East. Regardless, those logs are going to be able to kind of help you narrow down like what's going on and where it's happening. And then going into VPC flow logs, that's just your network traffic. So looking at any unusual traffic patterns or seeing any spikes in traffic, which is useful for things like exfiltration or like unauthorized access attempts. There's a bunch of different things that would be applicable there for VPC flow logs. That's probably the second most used logs in what I do in the incident response team. And so the next one is, go ahead.
So really quick on that point, I think it's important to call out is what you're looking for within those different logs, right? Because you have VPC flow logs, you have CloudTrail. The first thing is you have to actually have these logs turned on, enabled, and logging for the regions that you have your resources in, right? Because that's the important thing is, one, this is when we go back to that threat hunter mindset, we want to have the mindset of, do we have the data we're going off of, right? Because when you look at patterns within your environment and you're kind of getting into that mindset, it's like, okay, unusual login times and locations. So if you know a user works from 9 to 5 and they're logging at 3 a.m. to do a login to some specific admin action, why are they doing that, right? Well, why is that triggering at that time frame? So that's one piece to consider, right? The other piece is the normal stuff. Is there a rapid sequence of failed actions? Are there multiple denied errors? Things of that nature that popping up inside the logs. Because when you start to go through having that threat hunter mindset, these are all the things that you consider. What is abnormal for your environment? And that's kind of when you have those conversations with customers is, okay, you really have to have your team be familiar with your environment, what they're looking for, right? What is unusual compared to you? Because not all environments are created equally, right? So you have to make sure that your team is trained to look for these certain deviations of behavior, right? And there's tools that you can use that we can get into in a little bit, but you want to have that common investigation workflow when you're going through it, right? So user logs in at 3 a.m. from a different country, all right, that's something that might raise a flag, and then you should have the appropriate alerts and mechanisms to scale with that. But that's something that you need to consider and call out, right? And the other thing is analysis paralysis, right? Because you go through so many of these exercises, and usually what it comes down to is, hey, I'm having this happening in my environment right now. Oh, do I look at these logs? Do I look at these logs? Where do I look? And kind of my service and kind of go-to tool is like something like OpenSearch, right? Where you have the ability to search, visualize, and go through a numerous amount of logs. You pair that with something like Security Lake, where you're ingesting. So to the point earlier, if you have something that's not necessarily AWS, okay, you're feeding it through the different formats into Security Lake, and then you're able to normalize that in a way that can be digestible to your threat hunters, right? So things of that nature. And Pete makes a call out. Guardian anonymous activity is very chatty environment with hundreds of accounts, especially net new. So, and that's a good point, is there's a lot of tuning that goes into the different environments. So you really want to go through your logs and set up different alerting pieces, custom config rules, based on what's happening within your environment. And after you go through an incident, or as you're laying out your overall target state security strategy to say, hey, we're going to do this for this alert and this, you tune it appropriately. So you go through, you make those different items, and sometimes you also have to make decisions with limited data, right? There might be something that's not captured or something along those lines. So when you're a threat hunter within your environment, you want to adapt, right? Use the tools that you do have. If you don't have, let's say, a particular service turned on or something along those lines, okay, can we turn it on? Or can we just go back to the basics of CloudTrail? Or can we trace back to who accessed this? The who, what, when, why, how kind of thing. Can we pull that? And CloudTrail is powerful because you can pull a lot of that stuff from just the CloudTrail logs because API activity. So things to consider. And I think to your point, Russ, of going through and understanding the different logging sources is very important, right? So you said the CloudTrail, VPC full logs. What else is on your list in the back of your head?
So yeah, definitely go with IAM activity logs. So using things like IAM Access Analyzer and stuff like that to be able to show you who has what permissions and things like when they've been last used. You could set different rules and policies like password rotation policies and hopefully rotating your access keys every 30 days according to best practices, stuff like that. So that's also going to be especially useful because IAM is how attackers get access. So that's going to be extremely important, as well as for if you do find something, the immediate containment action would be to get rid of those credentials. So that's going to be another one that's going to be extremely important to threat hunting. So not just seeing the activity, but seeing who's doing the activity and whether that's aligned with their permissions or what they're supposed to be doing and stuff like that. So yeah. And thank you. I got distracted by the question and kind of just went right into it. But yeah, you're right. We should definitely kind of level set and define what we're talking about with threat hunting and what we're looking at. And the other thing that, I think there's a little bit of confusion about threat hunting. I said this in our last episode about threat hunting, but it's really important because I think people sometimes misunderstand like what the purpose of threat hunting is. And so, from the perspective, the general cybersecurity perspective, we have our passive detection, which is, all of our SIEM and alerting rules and stuff like that. And then we have active detection. So that's when you're actually going through looking for signs of maliciousness. So usually there's different ways that people prefer to threat hunt. There's a couple different methods, but really you can do it based off of, like threat intel based. So what actors are, known for what common attack patterns or and using those to be able to whatever isn't caught by your detection to go through manually. And so that's one way. It doesn't really matter how you're doing it as long as it's organized. Because you can't just say go threat hunt. Like, that's like, sending a kid into the middle of the woods and saying, go survive. You know what I mean? It's just too huge of a task. There's too much data. There's too much. So very focused, based off of threat intel, or you could do it from more of a theory standpoint. So just being like, knowing that my environment has weaknesses, say, in this area, because of printers or whatever. It's going to be printers. And so you're like, what? Let's do an entire threat hunt on just these connections. All of our networked printers or what have you. So you're kind of like doing that as a hypothesis where it's like, I think then all of our networked printers are vulnerable and possible for attacks. So let's go through and see whether they show any signs of that, or if we have something that shows out as suspicious. So that's why we need these logs to be able to see what happened and show something that's outside of standard, outside of our normal or routine.
And along those lines, we have a question. If we use CloudFront, we have less security problem because all our environment will not be public. Is it right? So CloudFront kind of set the baseline as more of a public content delivery network. So you can do things like IP restrict and think of other items to help reduce your attack service. I'm thinking of the WAF integration with CloudFront, for example, where you can set up different rules and things of that nature. So that's the way I would think of it. Of, hey, you can add a couple of more layers, and we always talk about the defense in depth and the layered approach, the Swiss cheese, and you turn the cheese kind of thing. So think of it that way, right? Where you can have OAIs, you can have the WAF, you can have all these different rule sets to help you as well, right? So it's a couple of different ways you can look at it as well. Well, thank you for that question. And also, I also love IAM Access Analyzer, Pete. It's a very powerful tool. So thanks for that. But I think to your point, Russ, is all these different logging sources and the ways we perceive it and go into it is very important, right? Because just look at the different ways that we were just talking about. We use CloudFront. Okay, there's a couple of different ways we can look at it because CloudFront generates logs, right? So now you can go through and look at those logging sources because then they can be another item in your tool belt, for lack of better words, right? So
definitely.
Yeah. So, and it also can provide some more real-time logs. And I think a lot of this boils down to, and I like to say it 3 times, target state security strategy, but also least privilege. And if you're using least privilege, we round of applause give to you for using least privilege, right? It's important to consider. So when you think of what Russ was just saying with IAM activity logs, that's a big item. And we keep going back to identity because how are users within your environment authenticating? How are they accessing the different resources? How do you know if something's abnormal within your service access patterns, deviations from baseline behaviors, things of that nature? A lot of it comes back to the identity side. So when you start to go down the maturity route of your AWS environment, you want to start to go towards like just-in-time access with the JIT, things of that nature, where users gets granted temporary access and they don't just long living. So very good thing. So, and we have a question. Hey, do you guys have the answers to the AWS exam? I'll tip some bits. So the answers to the AWS exam are all over in terms of the documentation and the study guides and materials and things of that nature. So, well, thank you for that question. And I think part of it as well is just hands-on understanding all these different items, right? And I know it's always fun. And thank you for asking that. Yeah. Always get one. And it's always the answers are in the books. Right? Also,
when we do touch on a subject that is related to one of the certification exams, we do try to throw a little, knowledge. What is, I can't think of the word, a little graphic. Yeah, well, there it is.
Yeah, just certificate knowledge. Yeah. See, it's almost like we planted them in the audience. But just for that one thing, certificate knowledge. But the other thing is there's a bunch of other Twitch shows too that are specific to the different exams. So if you haven't been watching those, I would subscribe to the AWS channel because there's some great shows along with, the Safe Room featuring Security SideQuest that go into a bunch of these topics. We like to go into some of the nuances. We like to go into understanding the customer stories. We like to go and find about the legends that occur within the environments that we hear about, that we see about, that when something is solved within the environment, you hear the round of applause by everybody from CISO and up, right? Because it's just such a great thing to understand. So this is a good starting point for today's SideQuest. So we threw out a couple of different scenarios today. But let's stick with that 3 a.m. scenario because that seems like it's a good place to start off with. And
the realistic place.
Yeah, right? It's like we're speaking from experience. So think of a principal security engineer. Their phone lights up. Despite all that is invested into the different tool sets. They had an attacker quietly moving through their AWS infrastructure for weeks, completely undetected by their SIM solution. What made this particularly concerning wasn't just the duration of the compromise, but it was the realization that the traditional alert-based detection had failed in certain spots because it's a sophisticated attack. Now, how does the organization environment adapt to that? How do we mature our infrastructure? It's a key component. And I think the place to start off for us with the question that we ask is, what's the most reliable detection method for this kind of case, a scenario?
It's these bad boys. No, but yeah, definitely. I think logging. I'm gonna go ahead and constantly, cite the various reasons why you should have logging. This being one of them. You don't know what happened. You can't find out, anything without visibility into the logs.
Yes, that is an important concept because sometimes when you're getting into mind of threat hunting, you start off with understanding, hey, these aren't authenticated users. These are just individuals trying to get access to my environment. So if I'm giving them a path, I don't want to give them a path, right? So what we have to figure out is exactly what Russ said, is what are they trying to access? What API calls are they trying to do within my environment? How do I secure these different pieces of information? So I think as we take the roundabout path of, hey, we have these users trying different actions within there, right? So question is when should we go threat hunting? How should we approach this? Do we do it from 9 to 5? Do we do it from 12 to 1 a.m.? What's your favorite time window for threat hunting, Russ?
My favorite time window is whenever there is time. Really. But it's also very contextual. As much as I hate this answer, it very much depends on your environment. And so depending on your, target state strategy and your threat model, like you have documents and things, or should have documents and things that kind of lets know how often that this should be done, whether it's like weekly or monthly or daily. Yeah. And also, you can still automate some of those searches to run, even though they're not maybe detections, but you can still run those queries, say, every week and just look at those responses, kind of see what stands out, basically. Especially if you're doing it like regularly, like every week, you'll start to see, you look through and you're like, this is normal, this is regular, this is one of our admins doing something, like, yeah, I know all of these. And then you'll be like, wait, hold on, what is this? This doesn't appear regularly. So yeah, yes. I think the routine at which you do it is important, but it is based off of your environment and your target strategy.
Yes, and I think that's an important part, especially if you look at the different tools that you may have at your disposal, like CloudWatch, right? So if you're looking for anomalies, one of the things is to understand your environment. So something like CloudWatch can present different pieces to you, right, in an organized fashion and way. And we do have some questions when it comes to how do I track the external IP address of the bad guy as they move through my environment? And this is a good question because there are a couple different ways. Because VPC flow logs, as mentioned before, by SI is an important part to consider because VPC flow logs capture network flows. So if you're trying to investigate, one of the great ways to do this is using and leveraging something like VPC flow logs or load balancer logs, depending on what you have up, or to the earlier point, CloudFront, right? So a couple different ways. I also throw in WAF because it was brought up. See what I did there? We named it for that piece. So we have another piece on the board. We have WAF face up as we're trying to figure out our environment. And for those who are just joining in, this SideQuest board is just a visualization of the AWS environment and the different tools and things and paths that we take in order to secure our environment. So we have something like WAF, we have CloudWatch, we have CloudTrail. I think to understand the challenge is a very important part, because we have sophisticated attacks, right? Even though we have tooling, there's alert fatigue. There's no proactive threat hunting. There's limited visibility into multiple AWS accounts, for example. All these are challenges that you face. And you may say, hey, I have these tools in place. Well, you have to think of the strategy, because if you have so many logging sources, what's your centralized logging architecture? It's an important conversation to have, right? Because you can have something like, let's say, Security Hub in place, but you still need something to centralize the CloudTrail across all the accounts, the VPC flow logs, and then maybe some other types of logs that you need to normalize within your environment. So you can deploy Security Hub, but you have to make sure you have something like custom insights on. Or you can also use something like OpenSearch, because they have dashboards for visualization. So these are all important pieces of the puzzle. And we could fill up this whole board with the different tools. But that's where the alert fatigue comes in, right, Russ? Where it's just like, oh, we have all these tools. And sometimes it takes understanding your environment in order to know what's best for your environment. And that's where target state security strategy. We say it 3 times for the people on the other side of the internet. But I think one piece is, Russ, what's one thing you wish you knew when you started threat hunting for the first time?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think having some sort of like formalized, pre-thought out plan for each of your hunts. If you're doing manual hunts, if you're just doing some like automated searches every week, then you don't really have to do that. But for actual manual hunting, like you should have a plan and an objective. And instead of just like going to see what you can see, I think, I know I already said it, but that's such a big thing. You know, you're looking for a needle in a haystack, then you should be focusing on needles and in that haystack, instead of, you know, just see what you can find.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that makes a good point, that we have to hit the good old timeout, pause, Zach Morris timeout, because we have to take that step back, right? And kind of understand, hey, if we're going to put together a plan, how do we do that, right? And I think part of that comes down to piecing together the clues for the different log sources, right? When you're going through the mindset, and if you're just brand new starting off, you may not know. So this is where creating something like a run book, as I mentioned earlier, but how do you fill out that run book is usually the problem. I think starting with something like an attack timeline is a good starting point, right? It's just like, hey, when an attack happens, what is the initial discovery point? How do I go from there, right, within your environment? Is that kind of one of the ways that you start out, Russ?
Absolutely. That's one of the biggest ways, is basically using that, what you actually were able to notice, and using that as kind of a touch-off point. So looking at what occurred and when, and then using that to either follow it back or forward. So seeing what happened before that. Say it's just a create access key, and you don't use access keys. So you'd look back and go to the logs. In this case, it'd be CloudTrail event history. So you look at that log and see, ooh, I see this API call for create access key. You know, it was done in this region by this user, looking at things like the IP address, how they logged in. Basically, once you start with that activity and you go to the logs, there's a bunch of information that you can use to kind of either pivot off of, or just use that to you know, navigate your investigation. So, you know, what services was it using? You know, did that credential do anything like creating new users? And so yeah, I there's a lot that you know, you can use to kind of aggregate, or not aggregate, but when you're looking to follow the attack timeline, it really does help to use that starting off point and figure out from there like who did it. Maybe once you have a user or a role, you can kind of see within that time frame what that user or role was doing. You can use the IP address, especially if we're talking about cross account, being able to see those IP addresses in multiple areas, because just like everyone else, sometimes threat actors are forget stuff, so they don't rotate their IP addresses or hashes or whatever, and so they leave you these clues. So something like connecting IP addresses, or just basically looking into the source of first of all your detection, whatever alerted you to this, whether it was manual or passive. So just using the information available to be able to find more information. So if we're talking about, say, for example, there was user behavior that was a little bit weird. So like we were talking about earlier, like off hours activity, or something that like the user doesn't do, like say, for example, they have permissions to your database because they're a database manager. But then all of a sudden they started messing with, say, SES, and you're like, well, why does the database manager need access to our email accounts? So stuff like that, like using, what about the user or their activity, or the amount of API calls that is normal for this user. Like if you're say in charge of IAM, you may have create users and delete users and create access keys and all those things that are a flag from a persistence standpoint, but that's just their normal activity. So knowing what is normal in your environment, so that way you can spot things that are not normal. The best way to do that in this specific example would be looking for the initial access point. Say, like a security group was modified that you saw in CloudTrail event history. So then maybe going through that, you look around the same time frame and find an IAM role created in some of the IAM logs. And then you find that there's directly after those two events, there's inbound traffic on port 22, and then you have to check your VPC flow logs. And so like when you're going through, like the investigation kind of does itself, you just have to be able to find those things, know where to look for the next step and the next piece of evidence. It is sometimes like being a detective.
And I think that's the important part to consider is it's kind of flows. So what you want to do is have some guardrails, for lack of better words, with your run book, right? So you have a common way to start off, right? If you have a certain discovery point, okay, this is how we map out a timeline. Just having a simple structure to that is important, right? Because everybody might approach things differently. And because of that, you may have some missing pieces of information. So you want to make sure that your run books are clearly lined up. So this is how we do an investigation timeline. These are how we document the event sequences. And then you can start to go into what you were saying with finding the gaps in the logging, adding context to the events, identifying the patterns. Okay, do we have tools to identify the patterns? Thinking of like something like detective where it groups and goes into that, or do we have to do it manually by looking through the logs and searching? So I think having this documented in a certain way will greatly help just the overall effort and cut down the time to react when it comes to these type of events within your environment, because there's multiple attack surfaces that you have to look at. And this is why the proactive threat hunting comes into play, right? Of like, okay, let's take a look at our environment and see what are the potential holes or gaps or something along those lines that we need to close, right? What are our authentication patterns and the login times, things of that nature? Like, what are the anomalies? And that's where we keep going back to what is our environment, and do we know if something were to happen? Do we have the proper alerts in place? Do we have the proper privilege escalation procedures, right, for role assumption? These are things that you say, oh, yeah, we have something in place, until something happens. It's like, wait, how did they get this much in the environment?
Oh, yeah.
So I think an important part to consider as well is, do you know what the most suspect item in your logs is? And this goes along with our theme, if you get this, but put 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat, right? What's the most sus item in your logs? Russ, what are you looking at? 1, 2, 3, or 4?
3.
New IM users with admin access.
Although I gotta say, I all of them. Really, they're all concerning, But if we're talking like vote out sus, like I'd say number 3. I think a new IAM user with admin access would be concerning, especially if you don't know of any new users that were supposed to be created, or or if that's one of your roles is creating new IAM users, and you're like, wait, hold on. That to me is the most suspicious, but they all have the possibility to be. So like, I mean, when we're talking about failed root login attempts, you're like, well, someone's trying to get root access. That's concerning. And so especially if they're immediately followed by successful root login attempts, then you've got a real concern. So I think all of these have their place, but I think for me, 3.
Yeah, and I think we have a couple of 3s and 4s in the chat. Mm-hmm. It's funny because if we're going with the usual game of trying to spot the imposter, failed root login is kind of like hiding in open sight, where it's just like, oh, catch me, right? I'm trying to get directly there. But I think with me, I would have to go with 4. Because with 4 is once there's quad zeros and open, you're open, right, to the environment. You don't need admin access or anything along those lines, because it could have just been a networking rule that was implemented. Now you have access to whatever's on the other side of that quad zeros. It could be your entire network. It could be data, all those things, right? So I think that's a big thing. So I think more people are leaning at the 4, and then maybe quad zero is the only one from private network to another. Yeah. So that's the thing, is 3 seems more critical. But if we're looking at everything, it's like Russ said, it's very hard to pick one. So yeah, 3 or 4, I think, is definitely the immediate critical, like, hey, we got to stop this now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think definitely going with that.
I mean, to be fair, I've seen incidents with all 4 of these. So, I mean.
Yeah. Look, this is the face of a man who's been through a lot of incidents.
Oh, yeah. Wow. I have to actually go through and like track and see how many incidents I've been a part of. Probably a lot.
Yeah. You didn't see the achievement pop up over your head?
100 incidents.
Yeah. So this is the thing. And these are little nuances that we like to do on our show, because we have the lived experience of both sides of the fence, of what we see and what can be helpful from a preventative or responsive and everything in between that. Because when you think of what goes into the mindset of a threat hunter is experience. A lot of the times it's like, hey, I've seen this before, so my mind goes to this. And then the important part is the documentation of that aspect. Did I document this? One, for my own sake, because you sometimes go through a loop, right? You go to one incident, you're like, all right, go to the next incident, you go to the next one. Then you come back to the original type of one. It's like, oh, what happened on that last case? This is why runbooks are important and documentation is important, or automated playbooks. We'll get to that in another episode because that's also an interesting place to be. But I think as we're starting to think of just threat hunting as a whole, we want to give everyone the different pieces of the puzzle in order to solve what the picture looks like. And the different pieces are starting out with your documentation, understanding your services, your environment, your architecture. So catch 2 hackers. Yeah, you catch 2, 3, 4, 5, and IAM user can pass SCPs you may have in place. So this is another side tangent that we'll go on because it's, safe room feature SideQuest. Because SCPs, you can also put RCPs into the picture, right? With resource-based policies. And when you look at your SCPs, you want to make sure that they're not the only thing within your environment, right? It's a guardrail that you put into place, but you should have other mechanisms in order to catch items, like other identity controls, or if you talk about S3, bucket policies, things of that nature. So Swiss cheese, defense in depth, all those good things, right? So that kind of leads us to the next question, right? Where we think of, hey, challenging threats. I think it's fun to jump back to back is, so we did suspect items in the logs. I think the next one, Russ, that is going to be interesting from chat to hear about, because what's the most challenging threat pattern to investigate? We have the low and slow reconnaissance, the service to service, the cross-account activity, and encrypted data exfiltration. So again, 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat. And it's funny, my mind goes to low and slow just because it sounds like barbecue. It's like the low and slow.
Yeah.
Right. But that's also one of the ones that, like, hey, they've been sitting in your environment for a while and nothing's caught it. Right. So I think that's a challenging threat just for the fact of, okay, how do I think about this? Right. Because you have to look at your whole infrastructure, your design, your architecture, and it's like, hey, how do I catch this? Right? Because they've been just sitting there, low and slow. What about you, Russ?
So I would agree, low and slow, especially if it's a reconnaissance attempt. It's super hard to be able to detect that level of like low traffic, especially if it's just like they're sending basically a ping request every, like, say, 48 hours or every week or something like that. Like, especially because it's a reconnaissance attempt, like, it's so hard to be able to suss that out. So I would say that one, but I also wanted to talk about cross-account activity correlation, which is actually a really interesting kind of topic, because it can be extremely difficult between accounts to be able to see what happened and, hey, is this, where does this, role come from, or where does this service account come from? So I think that's also another tricky one that isn't talked about as much.
Yeah, and we also have a call out to number 2 as well, service to service permission abuse, where this is where you get into a topic of the confused deputy problem, right? When a service with high privileges can be tricked into performing actions on behalf of an attacker. So it's a interesting concept, right? As well as other over provisioning items and role claiming and other aspects like that. So there's things that you put into place to help with this, right? We were talking about SCP policies and least privilege and different, org principle, resource principle, all those kind of items. So I think that one's also interesting to go over as well, right? Mm-hmm. And surprisingly enough, is nobody picked encrypted data exfiltration. Right? But I wonder if that's because they're like, oh, it's encrypted, right? It's encrypted anyway. So what's going on? But I think we had that episode on quantum computing, right? If you think about the rate of the potential of the future of maybe having something like quantum in place, if you exfiltrated all of that data at some point, might be something to consider, right?
Mhm.
Because they could unencrypt.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Especially, if you don't have your own encryption in place, then someone that has access to your account can just encrypt whatever's not encrypted and then take the key, and then you don't have access to anything.
yeah, exactly. And that leads us
There is.
down a whole other
It is.
topic. But I think things to look out for as you're going on these different quests of the knowledge variety is, what do I need to know to start off with? What are the basics? I think that's an aspect that's often overlooked, especially when you're starting out with threat hunting, is you want to jump into all the cool stuff and let's just do this. But I think you got to take it step by step and kind of realize, all right, what is the L100? What is the beginning, right? If we're in the Among Logs universe, what does the crewmate trainee do, right? How do we go through this? I think the best way to do that is, let's start out with the documentation, right? What is CloudTrail? Going through that's an important aspect of threat hunting, is understanding how CloudTrail works, the terminology. Do I have it on? That's a question that a lot of people ask, right? And kind of going through and understanding the different parts of the service. I think this is a good starting off point, because when you start to understand what each part of the service does, then you can start to say, all right, what does it eventually bubble up into? And that's when you start looking at something like Security Hub. And it's like, all right, what does it do? And you kind of see the reoccurring theme of jumping from one item to the other because it's connected. Then eventually you branch out in your own knowledge and your own environment, and then you start to get to that concept of, hey, I think I understand a little bit of this, right? Now, if something were to happen in your environment that's not Amazon Guard Duty, comes in, because I think you would agree, Russ, when you think of kind of like threat hunting and threat modeling, threat detection, all those things, Guard Duty is always is there. It's like standing in the corner, just like, tag me in. Right?
Yes.
It's just like, yeah, it's just because it does exactly what is here, right? Data exfiltration, unauthorized crypto mining, all these different items that you can set up to alert on if something is happening within your environment, right? It picks up and it is like, okay, this is what's going on, gives you the information about it, right? So, important part to start off with, if you are a trainee or level 100 in
I
your
do
mind.
want to jump in real quick.
Yeah.
Just as talking about Guard Duty, there is a service that does allow you to like automate monitoring of the Guard Duty findings. So that is the AWS Security Incident Response service. Does actually have access to service level permissions and lets it read security findings from Guard Duty through Security Hub to automate and decrease the amount of findings based on like expected behavior and your environment. So there is something there that is helping people tune and kind of go through and decrease those false positive rates.
Yeah, and that's an important part. Thanks for calling it out, because it goes down to understanding all these different connections, right? That's an important connection, and it's a powerful connection at that, right? Because you're learning off of all these different experiences to eventually become a security officer, right? Like, hey, you leveled up a little bit, L200. And that's where you start to get into, okay, analyzing logs. You use different services. I talked about OpenSearch, but there's something like CloudWatch Log Insights where you can also leverage this. It's another piece that is, I'll highlight it, exact purpose built, right? And I always like to say the word purpose built, because it's like, hey, it was built with the purpose of doing this task. So try it out and see if it does this task for you. And if it doesn't, there's something else that may work within your environment. But the first part is understanding the different components of it. And another fun aspect is the security blogs, right? Security blogs are essentially those pieces of documentation and information you grab after your 5 a.m. run, grab your coffee or tea, water, other beverage types, and you sit down and you're like, all right, let me look at what has been done in the past. And as a security officer, security blogs are interesting. And this one blog, mapping AWS security service to the MITRE framework for threat detection and mitigation, is an interesting one to go about, right? Because you're starting to think of, hey, do I understand MITRE ATT&CK and how it can apply within my organization? Or how do I use it? How do I leverage it? How do I structure everything against it? When it comes to understanding MITRE, Russ, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important do you think it is to understanding a threat framework like MITRE?
So a 10. I'd say a 10. Yeah. Definitely. I use it every day. I am tagging my incidents with different wow, the words are just killing me. But the different methods from the attack framework. And we also, I think, recently just released some new AWS specific tactics. I think that was just released. I read about it last week.
Yes.
So that is cool. It's very specific to AWS and the cloud.
Exactly. And those are the kind of things that you want to read at, especially after your 5 a.m. run. That's the important part you can't forget about, right? Because that's the path and the way and methodology to get into the elite operations commander status within your Among Logs organization, right? And the way to do that is understanding threat modeling, especially for builders, right? Because threat modeling is a step that it's for builders, but it's for everybody within the organization. Everybody should be a part of the exercise of threat modeling. But to start off, go through the workshop of understanding, hey, what is MITRE? And go through the introduction, go through, hey, what are the stakeholders, the shared responsibility model, all those different pieces of the puzzle. Because you want to know, what are we working on? What can go wrong? And what are we going to do about it? Important parts of the puzzle that we always have to consider and go about, right? Because when you are leveling up yourself and your environment, you want to consider all these different factors. One of those factors is, do I know what the potential threats to my environment are? And if you don't, that's okay. You can learn. You can go through and, go on something like a knowledge quest. Because a knowledge quest is essentially those pieces of information that I always preference with building your aura, but it's really building up your XP points. Because when it comes to understanding a threat hunter mindset is experience. And you can do those experiences not actively, hopefully not in the midst of incident within your environment, but going through workshops and looking at documentation and going to the different services and playing around with like, hey, what is guard duty? Oh, you could generate, fictitious alerts within guard duty just by pressing, hey, generate some alerts, some sample, just to see what they look like within your environment, right? And what's another thing that they can do ahead of time, Russ?
Yeah, to create your incident response plan. So that way you know what to do when you do find something while you're threat hunting.
See, it's important parts of the same puzzle because without an incident response plan, you get to talk to Russ. Fun person, but you don't want to talk to Russ. Right? No, maybe.
But if you do have to, we'll get you set. We'll set you up straight. I'm good.
Yes, exactly. And we'll have conversations because the whole cycle continues. And that means learning from what happened. And how do you do that? Well, you go on some threat hunts within your environment prior to what occurs. And that's how you update your incident response plan, your target state security strategy, and everything in between. And with that, we are going to have a good day. Why? Because we just completed this episode in this manner and fashion and way. So thanks as always for everybody joining in and having some fun talking about some logs of the Among Logs variety. So, all right. Have a good one. Take care. Thanks for joining, as always.